Why do 11 Mexican men carry a British clock tower into the stadium every week? If you look at Mexico's oldest football club, Pachuca FC, they march onto the pitch with this unmistakable English monument right on their crest. The players wear it over their hearts, the fans wave it on their flags, and yet, most of the people carrying that image today have no idea who actually built that structure or why it's standing in the mountains of their country. Let's look at two very different mining legacies. On the one hand, you have American football naming a team after miners, the San Francisco 49ers. They literally carry the gold rush in their name. It's a straightforward, highly visible history. They found it bold, they kept the name. But 25 years before that, a different group of miners traveled south, deep into the mountains of Hidalgo, Mexico. They were hunting for silver. Well, they lost the silver, but they kept the clock, and they left behind a much more profound, hidden legacy. In the early 1820s, Mexico had just won its independence from Spain, but it inherited a massive catastrophe. The silver mines of Pachuca and Real del Monte were completely flooded. Now, these weren't just any mines. They were the richest veins in the Western Hemisphere, producing over half the silver Spain had extracted over 3 centuries. But the war had destroyed the infrastructure. The old animal-powered hoists, which basically used leather bags pulled up by mules, just couldn't reach the depths they knew anymore. The silver was down there, resting in the dark, but nobody to get to it. So in 1824, the newly independent government took a huge risk and opened the country to foreign investment. Enter the British gentlemen adventurers. They partnered with the Mexican owner to install modern steam technology. 1,500 tons. That's the sheer crushing weight of the steam engine equipment that 60 Cornish miners hauled across the ocean in 1825. To win this bet on the silver, they needed these machines. And to run the machines, they needed these specific men. They understood rock, water, and the pitch-black environment of underground work. They had successfully pumped flooded shafts back in Cornwall, and they fully believed they could do it in Mexico. They sailed out of Falmouth and eventually unloaded all this iron onto the muddy swamps of Mocambo Beach. Setting out from that coast, the convoy harnessed 550 mules. It was grueling. Early rainstorms carved deep trenches into the earth, and animals were literally suffocating in the mud, but the men faced worse. Over the course of this 14-month march inland, 30 Cornishmen and 100 Mexican workers were lost to yellow fever. At one point, an engineer named John Buchanan was struck down by severe abdominal spasms. He somehow recovered, stood up, and just kept walking. Finally, in May 1826, the survivors stumbled into Real del Monte. Church bells rang, a band played. It was a triumph of human endurance over a completely indifferent landscape. That arrival was a physical victory, sure, but it turned into a massive economic anticlimax. The British gentlemen adventurers ran this operation for 25 years. It took them 3 of those years just to drain the water out of the mines. And yes, they found silver, but nowhere near enough of it. They lost over $5 million, a huge fortune for the time, and never recovered their investment. Finally, in 1849, right as the California gold rush was starting, they gave up and sold the operation. The buyers? A Mexican consortium. And here's the kicker. They worked the exact same veins, using the exact same steam technology the British had hauled across the ocean, and within a single decade, they made a fortune. The extraction bet failed entirely for the very men who brought the machines. When a community finds itself 6,000 miles from home, it tends to build a parallel life. The Cornish presence didn't extract much wealth, but it permanently altered the silhouette and the soul of Pachuca and Real del Monte. They built neighborhoods with these distinct pitched red corrugated iron roofs. They brought Methodism into a fiercely Catholic nation. They established a cemetery, they financed a clock tower, and they introduced a game. They also brought their food. Down in the mines, the Cornish workers ate a baked pastry filled with meat and potatoes. It was specifically designed to survive a long, dirty shift underground. Well, the locals watched, tasted, and eventually adapted it. The dough changed to suit local Mexican ingredients, leaving the wheat flour crust as the only real foreign element. This miner's meal was entirely consumed and transformed by local tastes to become the paste hidalgoense. Today, it's the regional identity food of Hidalgo state. The local culture took a foreign object, altered its contents, and cleaned it for their own. 755. That's the number of graves in the Pantheon in Glass, an elevated cemetery resting on a hill above Real del Monte. There is a melancholic devotion here. Every single one of those graves remains eternally oriented toward Britain, facing an island that most of the deceased would never see again. The men buried under those stones came for silver, built a community, lost the mine, and stayed in the ground. Among those who stayed was a man named Francis Rule. He arrived at 18, eventually took the Spanish name Francisco, and amassed immense wealth. They called him the Silver King. Now, Wool considered himself, in his own words, British to the backbone. Yet, when he financed a 40-meter English clock tower with machinery shipped straight from London, it didn't actually become a British monument. It was inaugurated on September 15, 1910, specifically to celebrate the centennial of Mexican independence. Its bells chime in a key of C major, and at 6 in the evening, they play the Mexican national anthem. The foreign extraction paid for the local celebration. The backbone was the only part of him that was still British. Everything else had been completely absorbed by Mexico. This national passion began quietly right around the 1830s. Cornish miners started taking the ball around the hacienda courtyards on their days off, just an afternoon way to kill time between shifts. By 1892, we see the first documented match, and Pachuca FC is formally founded by the British colony. 10 years later, in 1902, the first organized football league in Mexican history is established by 5 British teams. In those early years, the game's survival depended entirely on British bodies being present to play it. But watch what happens next. By 1915, the Pachuca roster becomes majority Mexican. The sport had evolved from an immigrant's afternoon distraction into a permanent Mexican reality. The man who carried the sport across that cultural divide was Alfred C. Kroll. He was this crucial, almost invisible bridge. Born in Mexico to Cornish parents, he learned the game in the very mine patios where his father worked. He learned the game in English, but he coached it in Spanish. He eventually led Pachuca to its first titles won by Mexican players, and in 1935, he took the Mexican national team to its first international trophy. The game arrived in English, but it was weaving in Spanish, guided by a man who fluently spoke both. So we arrive at a crucial distinction: adoption versus digestion. Adoption is merely borrowing a culture while keeping it separate. Digestion is consuming a culture until it becomes your own blood. Mexico didn't merely adopt the game of football, the pace, or that clock tower. It entirely digested them. The pace changed its filling, the clock plays the national anthem, the game shed its English roots and kept only its rules. You cannot uneat what is already running in your blood. Digestion is irreversible. The men who came for silver lost their money, they lost their colleagues, and they lost the mines. But they left behind a game that no longer belongs to them. The San Francisco 49ers know exactly where their name came from, but Pachuca's players carry the clock into the stadium every week without needing to know whose money built it or what language the first rules were written in. The game is theirs now, completely and fluently. Next time you see that clock tower on a jersey, stop. Look again. You're looking at a history entirely consumed, living on in the blood of a nation. Basta. This is Mexico.
If something here opened a door, stay and subscribe. Basta is the second look. Mexico without the filter, without the shortcuts. New episodes every third day. See our suggested video in the box.